Welcome back, I'm Kimberly and this is Floral Art on Lines, the Designs Dissected series where we use our AI, DesignEye, to analyse some designs and give us some suggestions of what we might do to improve those designs. This week our two designs are Beyond the Boundaries, which was staged on a bench, and From the Land, which was a wall hanging, where only roses could be used as the flower in the design. So let's first of all look at Beyond the Boundaries. Now this was a design that was actually part of an online competition during one of the periods of lockdown that we had in recent years, and it was very difficult for me to photograph the finished design to give the judges an idea of the depth of the design. And that was what I was most concerned about when I submitted the design. The title was Beyond the Boundaries, and what I wanted to do was have the bulk of the design outside of the container. So you can see there I've got a ceramic container, I think probably used for, made specifically for Ikebana. It's like a fold over of clay. It doesn't quite join more than halfway up in the container, so you'd have to have the water in the base of the container, or your water source in the base of the container. So I decided that I would go with more dried material, simply because we weren't restricted by having to use fresh plant material, so I thought I would go with dried plant material and highlight the way that we can move a design outside of its container. So within the container itself, within the vase, there's some jute sliver, which is the offcuts of making jute in factories. So it's a plant material, and one lot is dyed pink, which reflects the subtle colour on the vase itself, and then there's the plain, more natural colour, which reflects the colour of the wheat. And the rest of the design is simply long wheat stalks that have been bent into angular shapes. I wanted to have intersecting lines and the heads of the wheat going in all different directions to give the design some depth. What I guess it doesn't do for me when I look at it in review now is that it's a little bit static. There's a little bit too much of the negative space at the top of the vase, between the top of the vase and the angular line that is going up out of the vase. I'm happy with it as a design and as a design concept, but I'm interested to see now what DesignEye's got to say, not just in terms of the design itself, but what its suggestions are for improvement, because this helps me in my journey. I quite like the idea of having a design plant material outside of a container, and so I'd like to explore that a bit further, and this exercise is going to help me. What then does DesignEye have to tell us, having analysed the image of the design? Line, first of all, the design prominently features lines created by the geometric structures made with the thin stalks. These lines are dynamic and angular, leading the viewer's eye through the arrangement and creating a sense of movement and direction. The shapes in the design are primarily geometric, consisting of triangles and other angular forms. These shapes are constructed in a three-dimensional manner, giving depth to the design. So that's reassuring that AI, given that all it looked at was the image, just as the physical judges did, felt that there was some dimension to the design, so that's good. The form is three-dimensional, achieved through the use of lines to create a structure that extends both vertically and horizontally. This adds a sculptural quality to the floral design. There are contrasting textures in the design: the smooth, hard surface of the vase, the rough, fibrous texture of the plant material, and the airy, delicate texture of the dry fibre in the vase. So I can see that, just in looking at it now and thinking about texture, there's probably not enough variation in texture, even though there are contrasts. I would probably think about doing a little bit more, emphasising the smoothness and being rougher still with the rough side of things, or shiny and flat. You know, there's not much difference in that sort of textural contrast. There's not much difference between shiny and flat. So that'd be something else that I would think about when I was redoing the design. The colour palette is quite neutral and earthy. The vase has a soft muted tone with subtle patterns, while the dry wheat is a natural golden colour. The use of such colours creates a harmonious and calm aesthetic. Space is effectively utilised, with the design extending beyond the boundaries of the vase and creating a sense of openness. Negative space around the structure helps to emphasise the geometric lines and forms. So what we don't assess on when we look at DesignEye is the physical limitations for the design. So this, I think, was probably a 70 centimetre wide design, and it's probably it's probably not big enough, doesn't use up enough of that space. But like we always make these decisions, I've got the container, I'm going to do it this way. And having larger lines extend out from that vase would put it out of proportion, I think. So let's see what else there is in the comments. Design achieves asymmetrical balance. The elements are not mirrored, but are arranged in a way that feels balanced due to the careful placement of the stalks and the distribution of weight and visual interest. So we're looking at there is that because the vase is quite dominant, could be quite dominant in the design, what I've done is balance that dominance of the visual weight of that design with interesting elements that mask it and that bring your eye away from it, rather than continually be stuck there looking at it. There is a contrast between the hard lines of the geometric shapes and the organic forms of the plant materials. Additionally, the smooth texture of the vase contrasts with the rough texture of the dried wheat. So once again, as I mentioned before, I'd like to see something in the shiny and flat contrast as well, now that I look at it in hindsight. Always a good thing. The emphasis is on the geometric structure extending from the vase. This is the focal point of the design, drawing the viewer's eye due to its complexity and prominence. So this is what I was saying about the vase not being dominant, that it would be very easy to fall into allowing that to become the dominant part of the design. Rather than that, I've managed to move the emphasis away from the vase to the plant material, to that geometric structure that is around the vase. Rhythm is created through the repetition of lines and shapes, leading the eye through the design in a flowing manner. The angles and intersections of the lines create a dynamic rhythm. Despite the contrast and variety of elements, the design feels unified. The colour palette, the consistent use of lines, and the cohesive composition contribute to a sense of oneness. And that's a very good thing for me to see, because once again, it's about making sure that it isn't two parts of a design. It isn't the container and it isn't the plant material. So I've achieved that by the repetition of what is within the design. The proportion of elements is well considered. The size of the geometric structure in relation to the vase and the plant materials create a balanced and aesthetically pleasing composition. So once again, you can see all of these areas where we are assessed in a floral design are linked with one another, and that dominance of the vase, the proportion of the plant material, the unity, all of those things are lessened if you've looked at them in conjunction with one another. So they all relate to one another, they all affect one another in some way. So let's have a look now at some suggested areas for improvement. Incorporate more diverse materials. Introduce a variety of materials with different textures and colours to add more visual interest. For example, incorporating fresh flowers or foliage could provide a contrast against the dried wheat and add a vibrant element to the composition. And that's very true. And as I said at the beginning, I made a conscious decision not to use fresh plant material. So that idea of a little bit of fresh foliage, I'd have to think about it so you'd look at it again in terms of the geometric shapes and the structural lines. So it might well be that you would have fresh foliage, so you might have some palm leaves, for example, but plait them or mat them or weave them in such a way that they repeat that geometric shape that we've already got with the good structure of the wheat stalks there. Enhance the colour palette. While the neutral and earthy tones are harmonious, adding subtle pops of colour could make the design more dynamic and eye-catching. Consider using flowers or other elements in complementary or analogous colours to create a more striking visual impact. And once again, that's very true, and I probably could have picked out more of the pink tones out of the vase, which I've done a little bit with the jute sliver that's inside the vase, but perhaps once again finding something that structurally had the geometric shape that we want to reflect. It wasn't too overpowering as a flower, because the colour, if I'm using that bright pink, that colour is going to start to be dominant over the other colours that are there. So just weighing up the pros and cons of the suggestions that are there. What else have we got? Refine the geometric structures. The geometric lines are a strong feature, but refining their arrangement could enhance the design, ensure that the lines intersect in a more intentional and harmonious manner, possibly experimenting with different geometric shapes or patterns to create a more cohesive structure. So it is, I grant you, very random the way I bent the stalks. What I was focusing on was getting depth, not particularly repeating the actual geometric shape as such. So that's quite a valid comment, or suggestion for improvement, I should say. Increase the sense of movement. To emphasise the theme beyond the boundaries, further accentuate the sense of movement and flow. This could be achieved by arranging the lines and plant material in a way that suggests more dynamic motion, possibly incorporating curved lines or spirals to contrast with the angular shapes. And I think spiral might be interesting. Spiral because in some sense the shape that is created by the heads of the wheat might suggest a spiral more so than a curved line. So I would take that on board as well. And I think we've got a couple more suggestions. Play with scale and proportion. Experiment with varying the scale of different elements to create a more engaging composition. For instance, using larger or more prominent plant material in conjunction with the geometric lines can add depth and interest, making the design feel more expansive. So that's where the manipulated palm leaf, perhaps making a mesh out of it, or interlaced leaves of the palm, or fronds of the palm, could give me that difference in scale and proportion and give me the colour. So once again, everything is related to everything else. Incorporate movement beyond the vase. To truly embody the concept of beyond the boundaries, extend elements of the design further beyond the confines of the vase. So as you can see, that even though those stem stalks come out from the vase, they come out from the vase. So this could include trailing vines, cascading elements, or even elements that appear to defy gravity, enhancing the sense of expansiveness and boundary breaking. So what I would think about there is to have something that goes, if I had a little bit higher, we could have we could have the spirals, and the spiral would imply movement, but also could have it free falling from that, the height, the tallest stalk that I've got there, that points towards the behind the vase, and I could have had something hanging off that on a fishing line that appeared to just be suspended in midair. Then that would have drawn your eye up to that, given some movement, given some physical movement with the air around it, as well as the implied movement of something that's gone beyond even the structure that's there. So I think that's a really good one for me to investigate further, and it's the sort of thing that lifts your design beyond what everyone else is doing, because we just need an edge. We need to think a little bit beyond what our normal design thinking is, and this is a way of helping us think beyond what we might limit ourselves to thinking about, or thinking that we can manage. So let's now have a look at our second design for this week, which is a wall hanging called From the Land. This is a wall hanging where there was no backing allowed, so it had to be free floating, so to speak. So what I've done here is used some gourds as the basis for the design. So there's a very long necked central one, and it has a rose in a vial in the top of it, and the crossbar is a piece of dowel that has been put through two smaller gourds that have the rougher texture on the outside, and the bowls of those gourds have got a little bit of floral foam in them with some roses and some wheat. This was a competition, I think I mentioned earlier, where roses were the only flower that could be used, so I've stuck with the white roses to complement the colours, the natural colours of the gourd and the wheat. The two drops on either side of the central gourd are made with paper covered wire. In essence, it's like a floral curtain, if you've seen that technique done over the years. So each section rather, has a bundle of either wheat stalks or wheat heads, and some of those have got a vial in them so that I could put the rose into them. And then to make it a little bit different and to create some contrast, I've put bundles of the wheat stalks only in a horizontal position rather than the straight vertical position. So let us see what DesignEye has got to say, bearing in mind that this design placed second in the competition. Looking at line, first of all, the design features vertical and horizontal lines created by the arrangement of the plant materials. These lines guide the viewer's eye along the length of the piece and contribute to the overall structure. The shapes in the design are mostly linear and geometric, with the arrangement creating a ladder-like appearance. The small round roses provide a contrast to the linear elements. And looking at it now, I think the roses are too small for this particular design. They're almost lost in the design. Sorry about the phone call in the middle of that. Let's move on now to form and texture. The form of the design is a three-dimensional one with elements extending outward from the base structure. So the base structure is that central vertical element. The use of the plant materials adds depth and complexity. There is a rich variety of textures in the design, from the rough natural texture of the gourds to the dry wheat to the smooth delicate texture of the roses. That's probably true, and it was probably more evident in the bigger picture than it is here. And I still, once again, as with the previous design in this week's review, I'm concerned about how much contrast of textures I'm putting into these designs, and I need to make sure that I have improved on that part of my designing from the time that these were done. These are a couple of years old now, so hopefully I've improved in that arena a little bit more. The colour palette is earthy and natural, with muted tones of brown from the gourds and wheat, and complemented by the soft white and green of the roses. This colour scheme is harmonious and evocative of natural landscapes. Now, I mentioned previously that I think the roses are too small, so we'll see what it says when we get to proportion. But I think perhaps that colour needed to come into this design a little bit more as well. Space is used effectively, with negative space around the structure, allowing the individual elements to stand out. The arrangement avoids overcrowding and maintains a balanced composition. That's good. It's always good to know that you have used the space and maintain some balance within the space that you've got. The designer achieves a sense of balance through the symmetrical arrangement of the elements along the central vertical gourd. The placement of roses and wheat on either side contributes to this balance. So I've got a reasonable amount of repetition in terms of the placements. I tried to vary it a little bit just so that it wasn't static and didn't look like it was manufactured, I guess is the way to think of it. But I'm still concerned about the size of the roses. And the more I look at it, the more it's sitting in my head saying they're wrong. Contrast. There is contrast between the rough linear textures of the gourds and the wheat and the smooth rounded forms of the roses. This contrast adds visual interest and highlights the different elements. So that's good. Once again, I would like a little bit more obvious contrast in it, and there's not a lot of contrast in colour, and there's not a lot of contrast in the surface finishes the way that I would like. Light and dark, as well as the rough and the smooth and the flat and the shiny, those sorts of things. The roses serve as focal points within the design. Their placement at intervals draws the viewer's eye along the length of the piece and provides points of interest. And that's true, and we don't want it to be a very static movement, so not the blob, 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 smarty approach. We want it to be a flowing design. Rhythm is created through the repeated use of similar elements, the wheat and the roses, at regular intervals. This repetition guides the viewer's eye and creates a sense of movement. Probably not quite as much movement as I would like, and I've got the curve that has come from natural curve of the gourds at the top, but I probably would like a little bit more movement obvious in the design. Unity. The design feels unified through the consistent use of natural materials and a cohesive colour palette. All elements work together to create a harmonious composition. So it's good that there is a sense of unity in the design. The proportion of elements is well considered, with the size of the roses balanced against the length and thickness of the gourds and the groups of wheat. This creates a pleasing visual ratio. You can tell by my reaction that I hadn't seen this until looking at it now. I don't think the proportions are right. I'm sorry. Perhaps the proportions are acceptable, but it's the scale that's not right. The scale of the size of the roses in relation to the other parts of the design, I don't think is right. Let's look at some suggestions for improvement. Add more colour variety. While the earthy tones are effective, adding subtle touches of colour, like green foliage or small flowers in complementary colours, could enhance visual interest and vibrancy. So yes, as I identified earlier on when we were looking at this review, it does need more colour. It needs something other than the white and the green. So because we could only use roses, then I would have to use different types of roses, and perhaps I would look more at, it might be better to have, rather than the rose buds, to have some full-blown roses, or to have a variety of opening stages in the roses to create even more interest and contrast as well, whilst still repeating that element that is the roses. Introduce curved lines. To break up the rigid linearity, consider incorporating some curved or flowing lines. This could be achieved with flexible branches or vines, adding a dynamic element to the design. Now, I think that's true. I think what it needs is perhaps what's it called? The string of pearls succulent, and have that wound through it. Once again, it's not a flower, so I can still use it. Or my problem with vines is that they always look, I come from a farm background, so a vine is a weed. So I have to look at other things that I can use that are not going to remind me of things that are on the farm. But yes, I do think there needs a little bit more repetition of the curved line. As I said, we've got the curved line of the gourds at the top, and I'd like to see a little bit more subtle repetition of that, and introducing the string of pearls or something green in that sense that was a little bit softer would help with that interpretation. Enhance texture contrast. Incorporating materials with different textures, such as smooth stones, moss or bark, could add more tactile interest and further emphasise the natural theme. So interesting that it mentions bark, because in this country the Australian gum trees shed their bark, and if there's any kind of moisture in the air at all, they will curl up and give us wonderful shapes, and that might have given me the movement, that sense of movement and the curved lines, without having to incorporate the green that I was struggling with in the last lot of comments that I gave you. Vary the element sizes. Now we're coming down to scale. Experiment with varying the size of the roses or adding additional elements of different sizes. So I'm glad it's agreeing with me in this. This can create a more dynamic composition and emphasise depth. Very much reminding us that it is good to go back and have a look at your designs with a few more years' experience and a few more years' exposure to other designers and to other sorts of feedback, and to actually revisit designs and think about them in terms of the knowledge that you've gained in the time that has passed since you did that design, because this is all about an educational journey for all of us, regardless of how long we've been doing it. Extend beyond the central axis. To create a more expansive feel, consider extending elements further beyond the central vertical gourd. This could involve trailing vines or longer grasses, enhancing the sense of growth and connection to the land. So that's a very interesting comment. Obviously, we were length limited, and I think I've probably used about 2/3 of the length of the space that we were allowed to use. But not to say that with the bark or the string of pearls of the succulents, that it could extend beyond where those bottom groups of wheat are, because that's a very hard finish. It's almost like draw a line across the bottom of the design and that's where it finishes, whereas something that's a bit more organic in its shape will lend us to think about connection to the land. But it's from the land is the title, and that's really, I've just taken things that would come from the land and put them into a wall hanging. Improve integration of elements. So ensure that all elements feel well integrated. For example, weaving grasses more intricately through the gourds or arranging the roses in a more organic pattern can enhance the overall cohesion. So that comes back again to talking about where I talked about the different stages of roses opening. So that would give us a more organic feel to what was happening with the roses. It might also subtly remind us that they've come from the land, and so there's all these different stages of the rose's growth, and I think it would fill the space a little bit better, make it not so harsh, the lines that are there. That's the suggestions from DesignEye, our AI analysis tool that he's looking at from the land, the wall hanging. So this week we've had two very different designs, very similar colour palette I will say, but two very different designs, Beyond the Boundaries and From the Land. And we can see from the comments that we've got and from the analysis that we've got that it has given me particularly some food for thought. So I would encourage you all to submit your designs to our DesignEye AI so that you can as well get the benefit of having an independent analysis of your designs and some suggestions for improvement. As always, once you submit your image of your design, it goes through the DesignEye process. A human, then looks at the responses to make sure that it will make sense to you and that it hasn't picked up some odd things or called plants the wrong names, those sorts of things. And then we send it on to you. So that usually happens in less than 24 hours. So it is a good, quick way for you to boost your ideas before you start your next planning for your next floral design. So easy as uploading an image of your design, and then the process starts. So that's all for our coverage of the two designs for this week. I'm Kim Bailey. This is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series.